Hello, I'm Ed Rabyd, otherwise known as the Rabyd Atheist, former pastor turned atheist, now compassionate anti-theist. Welcome to my channel. You're free to like or dislike the video as you see fit, so feel free to hit those buttons. Feel free to comment below, and I would appreciate it if you would subscribe to the channel and hit your notification bell for more content as it is released. You're also free to share my videos as much as you like. Today's topic, I feel, is kind of a necessity because there's several issues that I think I can address as somebody who used to be a pastor for a long time, as somebody with a political science degree, who's made a personal study of the Constitution a little bit of the United States, and somebody who's done a little bit of research on this issue. I want to respond, I guess, currently the coronavirus, the COVID-19 is kind of running amok on the planet. And a lot of people, particularly in the Western world and other places, are quarantined. And, we have orders not to travel, not to move around, things like that. In my case, for instance, I'm pretty much restricted to home and work. And my work is considered an essential business, which is part of the issue here. And I want to talk about that just a little bit, just to kind of set the stage. I'm not going to go into too deeply, but the real problem that the politicians have created with this definition of essential business is what is essential to them and to the government and to, quote unquote, the survival of the country, and what is essential to a lot of other people is going to be very, very different. That word essential is unfortunately a very opinionated word. It is not, when somebody is labeled as an essential business or an essential employee, that is in economic terms not what we would call a positive statement, in the sense that you can prove it beyond most reasonable doubt or above suspicion. It's more of a normative statement, which means it really depends on your point of view. To some people, essential business would be, food, clothing, shelter, things like that, making sure, the lights stay on and things like that. While other people, almost everybody who's probably been laid off because of this or put into a position where they've had to close their business, is saying, yeah, except my business and my job are essential to me. And so from their standpoint, there is no such thing, as a non-essential business. Now, we've also kind of created another class divide here in the country then, because there's essential businesses and essential employees and others that are not essential and not, essential business and non-essential employees. So it's really created a bugaboo. I'm suspecting that after all this is over, there'll be tons of lawsuits from businesses for being labeled non-essential. And they're going to make their case in front of the courts as to what is and is not essential. There's a lot of things going on here. I'm going to talk about constitutional rights, but I do want to understand, in our country, it is very possible to, after the fact or even during, sue when the government is doing something, and sue the government directly and say, no, you can't do that. One of the great classic historical examples is, for instance, Lincoln's, two things that Lincoln did that were later, after the Civil War, overturned and declared to be unconstitutional. But President Lincoln did suspend habeas corpus, which is the right to trial by jury, a speedy trial. And then he also, he suspended pretty much the right of civilians to be tried by a civilian jury. In fact, he allowed military tribunals to try civilians. This is what happened after his death. The people that were put to death for the assassination of President Lincoln, including the first woman in a while, were all tried by a military tribunal, not a civilian court, even though all of them were civilians. Later on, the Supreme Court of the United States declared both of those policies to be unconstitutional. I recently saw a story, I don't even remember it, but I basically shoved it aside because there was some politician or bureaucrat suggesting this very thing, that people can be held without jury trial or bail or anything. And yeah, probably somebody probably told him, yeah, Abraham Lincoln did that, and yeah, it's already been declared unconstitutional. You can't do that. So that kind of thing happens. I think after this is over, the policies behind this quarantine. This is the first time in my memory that the United States has faced such a massive quarantine, and it's been a while. Yes, back in when the Spanish flu was rolling out, people were quarantined, people were asked to stay home, things like that. It's very similar. There were cases that came out of there that said what the government could and could not do, and I suspect that this will be the same. And I think one of the things that's going to be yelled at is this definition of essential business. I'm going to speak for myself, for my own job. I can't see why other businesses can't limit the number of people in their store, like we kind of do, suggest certain numbers. I don't see why other businesses can't enforce 6-foot rules and sanitation procedures for their employees and for people that come into the store or whatever place of business. Many businesses are not. You go in and you're the only client there talking to one other person. It's the businesses where people have to touch you that become a problem. Hairdressers and things like that. That becomes an issue because those people are actually touching their client, and that becomes an issue. But the same is also true for doctors and nurses, and nobody's telling doctors and nurses that they can't touch their patients in order to administer healthcare. So what I'm saying is this is a big mucked up mess. So what does this have to do with religion and the First Amendment? This whole quarantine thing and essential stuff. Well, over the course of this last week, I've seen at least 3 or 4 stories of people, or particularly pastors, arrested for violating the quarantine rules. They've had church services. There's been one case where a church did have somebody with the coronavirus in it, and it became spread among the congregation, and I think one person died. I'm not really, somebody can give me a link to that story, but I think I read that, but I lost it and I couldn't find it again. So it might not be true. But there's this idea out there, I could go on and on as an atheist about how faith makes you stupid and thinking that you can pray to Jesus and you're going to put a hedge of protection around you and that's going to protect you from the virus. No, it won't. It's a good way to get the virus. It's a good way to think. I mean, that's a pretty arrogant thought if you really think about it, that somehow you're so special to God that God is going to protect you. So I could go on and on about how these pastors and churches are stupid, but I want to talk about really the issue of all of this. Some of the pastors have argued that spiritual life is an essential business because it deals with a person's spirituality, and people have a right to exercise their religion as they see fit. And so therefore they have the right to assemble if that's part of their religion. There's a couple of things that need to be remembered about a couple of these rights. There are 3 constitutional rights that are exercised every Sunday when a church has a service and a pastor preaches. Okay, the right to assemble is used. The right to free speech. The pastor is going to speak, and nobody can censor him really. And the right to free exercise of your religion. Now, a lot of churches have recognized the problem with the right to assembly because there is a qualifier. The word is peaceful. I'm going to put a link in the description to a Library of Congress article about the right to peaceful assembly, but the qualifier is peaceful. The Supreme Court of the United States has ruled on this. I'm going to read a paragraph from this article. The Supreme Court of the United States has held that the First Amendment protects the right to conduct a peaceful public assembly. The right to assemble is not, however, absolute. Government officials cannot simply prohibit a public assembly in their own discretion, but the government can impose restrictions on the time, place, and manner of peaceful assembly, provided that constitutional safeguards are met. Time, place, and manner restrictions are permissible so long as they are justified without reference to the content of the regulated speech. are narrowly tailored to serve the significant government interest and leave open ample alternative channels for communication of the information. Going on down, what you also get with this is the idea, if you read the whole article, the idea is that the government can put restrictions on the right to assembly if it is in the public interest to do so. And I think this is kind of where the quarantine comes in. And they do have the right to shut down assemblies because it's in the better public interest, not for large groups of people to meet while the virus is going on. And I would agree with that. I do believe that the Constitution allows the government to restrict or limit the right to assembly based on the peaceful qualifier to maintain, the general welfare. And part of the general welfare is trying as best we can to deal with this virus and keep it contained. I would argue, however, that probably a better thing would have been to come up with a universal standard ahead of time of what every business and what every person can do to maintain this quarantine so everything could stay open, business could be conducted as usual. You could have encouraged people to stay at home, but not necessarily have every business shut down simply because they're non-essential. I think they're by using the essential, non-essential thing, the government is just asking for trouble, and they're going to get it. And that's unfortunate because in addition to all the extra costs of all the money that's being thrown at the problem by the government, I think you're between unemployment benefits and God knows what else they're going to do. They're going to end up losing a bunch of lawsuits because I already can hear construction companies going, yeah, most of my guys, my crews are 2-3 people and they work separately in different places of the building. Why can't they continue to do that? They have a point. As long as they're, washing up and keeping clean and keeping away from each other, what difference does it make? There's a lot of businesses like that. Thankfully, office employees can usually work from home and things like that. But the right to assembly means that you cannot always assemble. Now, here's the problem with dealing with churches. And when I see these pastors being arrested for having a service, and I'm going to deal with a couple other issues when I talk about the business of church, I understand their fear because I've been there. A good chunk of churches are a Sunday away from closing the doors financially. This is simply true. My first church struggled financially all the time. There were good days and bad days, but at the end, literally, I was not taking half of my salary just to keep the doors open. There were days that there was nothing in the checkbook after I got paid. So, and I knew that I was not unusual in that regard. So a lot of these pastors are indeed motivated by trying to keep afloat. I know a lot of pastors have put out the plea. They went to an internet type of service, which I think is a smart move because you're still, you can still have your right to exercise your religion by gathering by social media. You can do that. I predicted that there would be internet churches, and there are internet churches that exist. So there's that. You can exercise your right to free speech that way. You can still exercise your religion. It's the peaceful qualifier and the public interest parts of the right to assemble where the government is going to look at a church and close them down. Now, here's where it becomes problematic for me, because this is where I may take the side of the churches just a tiny bit, because I believe very much in the separation of church and state. I think it's one of the most brilliant things that the Founding Fathers ever did. By keeping religion out of politics as much as possible, we are able to conduct ourselves fairly and with a lot of equality. The moment you start bringing in beliefs is the moment you're going to create some inequities, okay? Because if you like the early part of the American history where people had the religious beliefs that black people were inferior because they were the sons of Canaan or whatever, and you start listening to some of the gobbledygook, that comes out of some of the theologies there, I think you're going to begin to realize that there's a good reason why that shouldn't have had any effect on public policy. That said, if we're going to say that this is a singular, complete dividing wall, that means that the state has to be very, very careful in how it interferes with religion. Okay. If you want this absolute wall of separation, that means the state can't muck with the church's business either. It's why I don't believe that churches should be taxed, because the moment you tax them, they're going to argue that then they have the right to petition like any other political entity on how that money should be spent. They're going to cry foul on the separation of church and state issue on the grounds of you're taxing us, so the state is reaching in and taking from our pocket, but then they're going to block us from talking about how that money is going to be spent. Yeah, they're going to have a good case there, and I think the Supreme Court would probably agree. I think that's why the government has never gone after churches, because they know they'll lose in the Supreme Court. If you're going to talk about separation of church and state, that's a wall. And I don't want the church to have a bigger voice in government. And I think if you tax them, you're going to absolutely give them that bigger voice, because they're going to start to argue. So they're going to argue the way I said, where they're going to say, listen, you're taking our money. We have a right to talk about, as citizens of the country, how it's supposed to be spent. We have a right to lobby. We have to the moment you start taking their money, businesses already lobby because the government takes their money. Individuals already lobby because the government takes their money. And so it gets really difficult to say that to those individuals and organizations, you can't do that. Well, you start doing that with the church, guess who else is going to be knocking on the door? They already do, but you start taking their money, they're going to do it even more. Okay, but when we get back to this issue here of the church, the real sticky wicket going down the road politically is going to be this. I think these pastors right now are hanging on their right to assembly, and that's not the angle that they should have used. They should have went the right to exercise their religion or the right to free speech. The problem is the government can come along and say, well, there's alternative ways to do that, which is what the Library of Congress article points out. And a lot of churches have headed down that road. I think the proper mode in quarantine for these churches to do is say, okay, we're gonna put our churches online if we can, and we're going to have the right, we're going to do it. The problem is churches are getting older. And this is a real catch-22 for churches right now, and I think it's very amusing to watch. They're getting older. A lot of the people in congregations don't have a flipping clue what the internet even is. I'm being serious. I pastored several churches. Most people were older than me. And a lot of them, when I told them that something was on our Facebook page, they would look at me funny, like, I don't do that. Okay, I come to church. So they come to church. That's where they're expecting to get information. The only thing you can really tell them is don't meet. We're not meeting until this is over. Well, that's bad news for churches, because unlike many other businesses, they're not going to get any aid from the government. They live Sunday to Sunday, many of them. They're not going to get any aid from the government. The government can't give them money. They're not going to be able to collect, because, the reason you meet most of the time, in my humble opinion, is to pass the collection plate. They're not going to be able to do that. And so, they're going to kick against this quite a bit. And it's because they don't just have the right to assembly to fall back on. They can also say, sorry, we have a right to our religion. We have a right to free speech. You're messing with those too. I don't know what's going to happen here. I'm just kind of laying out some of the issues. My issue right now with this is I don't see the government coming out of this without major lawsuits directed at them. There's going to be some constitutional cases that are going to happen. I think what's going to end up happening in retrospect is Congress is going to sit down probably and create a whole bunch of laws regarding quarantines and what can and cannot be done based on what happens in the Supreme Court. They're going to end up, you're going to see a lot of cases over the next couple of years directed at the court system because of all this stuff, from businesses, from individuals, from religious, from church people. The real issue I have is I think the government, based on the Constitution, does have the right in the public interest to quarantine us in that sense. But I also think if they're going to open the door and say, these are essential businesses, you've opened a can of worms. They really should have just said, every business is still allowed to be open, but you're going to have to follow these procedures to stay open. That would have been a better move, and it also would have kept the economy going a little bit more better. But the way they did it, I think they kind of made it an all or nothing thing. And so we're going to see what happens. But I just wanted to get it out there that, the government is within its rights to restrict movement and free assembly if it's in the public interest. The Supreme Court has ruled that way several times. While churches can exercise their free exercise of religion and free speech, they can do that through alternative means other than gathering every Sunday. The problem is, to a lot of people, gathering every Sunday is part of the religion. The Hebrew book of Hebrews 10, I believe, says, do not forsake the assembling of yourself together. There's more to it than that. And a lot of pastors are saying, on a spiritual level, churches are essential business. We're helping people stay calm. We're helping people, get their spiritual center and focus. As an atheist, I may think all that's bunk, but I think, much like any other business that's been shut down by the government, they're going to be able to make their argument. They're going to be able to have their day in court and say, yeah, well, essential is in the eye of the beholder, isn't it? And that's going to be the real problem. And as somebody who's a critic of government, I think government in this particular case really didn't think their solution through very well. And that may be due to the fact they're dealing with a crisis and they have to push something through really quickly. I try to give human beings the benefit of the doubt, but at the same time, somebody should have been saying, hey, there's other ways to do this. Are there alternatives? It seems that we were all too quick to say quarantine is the answer and only certain people can go to work and this sort of thing. I think that's going to have a backlash down the road, but we'll see what happens. But I wanted to get it out there what the Constitution allows and what these church pastors are doing. I'm going to keep my ears to this one because it interests me. Keep my eyes on it, and we'll see what happens. I want to thank you for stopping by to my channel today, and welcome. You will see that comments have a way of influencing Friday's videos and its content. I've got a pretty good one this week, too. You can also ask me a direct question at any time. If you're looking to understand something, I would appreciate any comments and questions. It's always welcome. And you can also drop me a suggestion of what else you'd like to see me do. The videos are usually uploaded Monday, Wednesday, and Friday around 3-ish, Monday and Wednesday and Friday-ish. Sometimes it's not always then. It really depends on my work schedule, which isn't steady. It's all over the place sometimes. One thing I won't tolerate is name calling, so be advised. If you want to demonstrate somebody has a foolish idea, that's one thing, but don't call them a fool. Be sure to like, subscribe, and get your notification bell rung as you see fit. And hopefully I can someday convince you to be a rabid atheist like myself. In the meantime, this is Rabyd, the Rabid Atheist, signing off and wishing you a good day.